500,000 years ago, on a humid riverbank in what is now Java, someone pressed a sharp point into the surface of a freshwater shell and drew a deliberate zigzag. The lines were not random. They were not the scratches of sediment rolling in current. They were placed with pressure, lifted, repositioned and drawn again. The hand that made them paused, adjusted, and continued. That shell, recovered from the Trinil deposits along the Solo River and dated to roughly 500,000 years ago, has often been treated as a curiosity, an anomaly attributed to Homo erectus, and then folded back into a simplified narrative. But the longer you sit with it, the more it refuses to stay small. It is not just the oldest known engraving. It is a message from a region that has been misunderstood. And when placed into its climatic, genetic and ecological context, it unlocks a different history of Southeast Asia, one in which Java was not a cul-de-sac at the end of an African expansion, but an engine of human evolution in its own right. To understand the engraving, you have to understand the world in which it was made. 500,000 years ago, Earth was deep in the middle Pleistocene. The climate was oscillating between powerful glacial and interglacial phases. Sea levels rose and fell by more than 100 meters over tens of thousands of years. During cold glacial periods, vast amounts of water were locked in ice sheets, and sea levels dropped dramatically. In Southeast Asia, that drop exposed the Sunda Shelf, creating a massive landmass known as Sundaland. Mainland Southeast Asia, Sumatra, Borneo and Java were not separate islands during those times. They were part of a continuous, lowland plain, crisscrossed by rivers, wetlands and savanna corridors. Animals moved freely across it. So did hominins. Around 500,000 years ago, Java was not necessarily isolated. It may have been connected to the mainland during lower sea levels, part of an immense ecological highway stretching from what is now Thailand and Malaysia down into the equatorial tropics. But the climate was shifting. Within the next 100,000 years, the planet would enter marine isotope stage 11, one of the longest and warmest interglacials of the past 500,000 years. Sea levels rose, coastlines retreated inland, the Sunda plains flooded. Java became increasingly insular. The same population that once could walk north into mainland Asia found itself gradually surrounded by water. Isolation is not a death sentence in evolution. It is a pressure cooker. It amplifies adaptation. It refines traits. It forces innovation. If the engraving dates to around 500,000 years ago, it sits right on the edge of that transformation, a moment when populations in Java experienced both continental connectivity and emerging island isolation. That oscillation would have shaped their biology and behavior in ways we are only beginning to appreciate. The traditional explanation is simple. Homo erectus made the engraving because Homo erectus is what we find at Trinil. Java man, discovered in the 19th century, became one of the icons of early human evolution. For generations, the region was framed as a distant outpost, populated by a hardy but cognitively limited branch of humanity that wandered out of Africa and settled there. In that narrative, Southeast Asia was a terminal branch. Homo erectus arrived, persisted, and eventually vanished. The engraving, if acknowledged at all, was treated as an odd flourish by an otherwise static species. But that story now looks increasingly inadequate. First, the engraving itself demands more than the word static. The zigzag pattern is not random scratching. Microscopic analysis shows that the lines were carved with a sharp tool, likely a shark tooth, dragged across the shell's surface in a controlled manner. The engraver maintained consistent pressure. The pattern appears to have been made in a single session. This required fine motor control, visual planning, and deliberate action. It was not necessary for eating the shellfish. It was not structural. It was not functional in a mechanical sense. It was a mark for its own sake. That alone disrupts the old caricature of Homo erectus as behaviorally simple. But the deeper disruption comes when we place this engraving alongside what we now know about archaic human diversity in Asia. Genetic research over the past decade has revealed that Asia during the Middle Pleistocene was not inhabited by a single uniform species. The Denisovans, identified from genetic material in Siberia, represent a distinct lineage that split from Neanderthals, perhaps between 400,000 and 700,000 years ago, with deeper roots stretching further back. Their genetic legacy is strongest today in Papuans and indigenous Australians, implying that Denisovan-related populations once lived somewhere in Southeast Asia or Wallacea before modern humans arrived around 50 to 60,000 years ago. This matters profoundly. It means that Asia, 500,000 years ago, was not a blank stage occupied only by Homo erectus. It was a mosaic of lineages. Populations were splitting, diverging, and likely interbreeding. Denisovans received gene flow from Neanderthals. Modern humans later received gene flow from Denisovans. Hybridization is not an exception in human evolution. It is a rule. So when we look at Java around 500,000 years ago, it is no longer sufficient to say, it was erectus, end of story. It is entirely plausible that Denisovan-related populations existed somewhere in mainland Asia during that time. During glacial lowstands, when Sundaland connected Java to the mainland, these populations could have moved south. They would have encountered long-established Java hominins. Interbreeding would not have been extraordinary. It would have been typical. A hybrid population could have emerged, carrying traits from both long resident Southeast Asian groups and newly diverging archaic lineages. This is not fantasy. It follows the pattern documented elsewhere in Eurasia. Now add another layer: ecology. Recent studies on the mosquito genetics suggest that malaria-carrying lineages targeting hominins in Southeast Asia may have begun specializing on human hosts around 1.8 million years ago. That pushes sustained hominin presence in tropical Asia deep into the early Pleistocene. Mosquito host specialization does not occur in response to transient visitors. It requires stable, reliable populations over long timescales. It requires dense enough communities to sustain parasite cycles. This tells us that Southeast Asia was not a marginal refuge occasionally visited by wandering bands. It was a long-term homeland for hominins. It supported populations large enough and stable enough to shape the evolution of other species. The environment itself was rich and complex. Java, at 500,000 years ago, was a tapestry of river systems, floodplains, mangroves, wetlands, and coastal zones. The Trinil site contains freshwater mussels, and evidence suggests that hominins systematically collected and opened them. Some shells show modification consistent with tool use. The engraving appears to have been made with a shark tooth, a resource found in coastal environments. That detail is critical. It implies interaction not only with rivers, but with marine systems. This was not a dry savanna lifestyle transplanted from Africa. It was riverine, aquatic, semi-maritime adaptation. It required knowledge of tides, seasonal flows, shellfish harvesting, and perhaps coastal scavenging. These populations were not confined to inland plains. They were exploiting ecotones between land and water. Stingray stingers were found with the shell, suggesting that this population was exploiting the sea for tools and food. When sea levels rose during a superinterglacial, Java became increasingly isolated. But isolation in a tropical island environment does not mean decline. It means intensification. Resources are concentrated. Social networks tighten. Cultural traditions can become more distinctive. An engraving tradition could emerge in such a context, not necessarily as art in the modern sense, but as symbolic marking, social signaling, or cognitive play. The zigzag pattern carved into the shell is simple, but simplicity does not imply insignificance. Geometric motifs appear again and again in human symbolic traditions. They're easy to produce, but require abstract thought. The ability to impose order onto a surface, to create pattern where none existed before. If this engraving was made by a hybrid Denisovan erectus population, as the broader context allows, then it becomes more than an isolated act. It becomes evidence that Southeast Asia was generating cognitive and cultural developments independently of Africa. It suggests that the roots of symbolic behavior were not confined to a single geographic cradle. The unidirectional out-of-Africa narrative tends to flatten regional complexity. In its simplest form, it imagines a stream of humans leaving Africa, replacing archaic populations elsewhere, and carrying innovation outward like a torch. Regions like Southeast Asia are treated as recipients, not contributors. but the evidence increasingly points to a far more tangled story. Java was occupied by hominins for over 1 million years. It experienced cycles of connection and isolation. It supported large, stable populations in tropical ecosystems. It sat at the crossroads between mainland Asia and the island chains leading toward Wallacea and Sahul. Later, Denisovan ancestry would flow into populations that ultimately peopled Papua and Australia. That ancestry did not originate in a vacuum. It had a geographic history. Seen this way, Java was not a dead end. It was a node, an engine, a place where lineages met, mixed and adapted. The engraved shell becomes the emblem of that engine. It is physical proof that 500,000 years ago, in a tropical river system at the edge of a changing sea, someone had the cognitive flexibility to mark an object deliberately. That act did not require modern language. It did not require Upper Paleolithic cave art. It required a brain capable of abstraction and a social context in which marking mattered. If Denisovan lineages were diverging by 600,000 to 800,000 years ago, and if archaic populations in Asia were interbreeding, then the individual who carved that shell may have belonged to a population that already carried genetic threads connecting multiple human branches. They were not a static relic. They were part of an ongoing evolutionary experiment unfolding across Eurasia. Population size matters in this story. The mosquito evidence implies sustained density. The ecological richness of Sunderland implies capacity for large communities. These were not isolated family units barely surviving. They were networks of riverine groups, perhaps numbering in the thousands across the broader region, connected by seasonal movement and mating exchange. Isolation during high sea levels would not have reduced them to nothing. It would have reshaped their networks. When modern humans eventually entered Southeast Asia tens of thousands of years later, they did not arrive in a pristine wilderness. They encountered descendants of these deep, archaic populations. Genetic traces of Denisovans in Papuans and Australians are the echo of those encounters. The roots of those Denisovan populations likely stretch back into Middle Pleistocene Asia, into environments like Java. The engraving does not prove every detail of this reconstruction, but it forces us to abandon the lazy explanation that everything in Southeast Asia before modern humans was merely Homo erectus in stasis. The archaeological, climatic and genetic evidence together paint a different picture. A dynamic, evolving interbreeding set of populations adapting to tropical coasts and rising seas. The zigzag on the shell is the quiet signature of that world. It says that 500,000 years ago Southeast Asia was not waiting for innovation to arrive from elsewhere. It was generating its own. It says that the story of human evolution cannot be told as a single outward march from one point of origin. It must include engines like Java, places where climate, geography and lineage diversity combine to produce new forms of behavior. The mystery of who made the engraved shell is not solved by naming a species label and moving on. It is solved by recognizing that the region itself was a crucible of change. The engraver was almost certainly part of a population more complex than the old narrative allows. Perhaps late Asian archaics, perhaps Denisovan-related, perhaps hybrids shaped by cycles of connection and isolation. What matters is that they were not peripheral. They were central to the unfolding human story. Java was not a fossil museum at the edge of evolution. It was an engine. Thanks for watching.